In May 1964, the soaring tenor voice that defined American pop music was found dead in a Harlem hotel room at just 27 years old. Yet, the corporate entertainment machine stretching from the Brill Building to the Las Vegas Strip didn't even pause for a funeral. While Rudy Lewis's body was still waiting in the morgue, executives brought in a replacement the very next morning to record the massive summer hit, Under the Boardwalk. The erasure was immediate, absolute, and perfectly legal. The needle drops onto the vinyl, the static clears for a fraction of a second, and a soaring, immaculate tenor voice fills the acoustic space. For millions of American listeners in the early 1960s, the opening vocal runs of Up on the Roof, or the smooth rhythmic cadence of Under the Boardwalk, provided an immediate, visceral sense of sanctuary. The voice promised absolute freedom, an escape from the grinding, claustrophobic reality of urban existence, and a perfectly sanitized romantic dream. It was the sound of a carefree summer, packaged and sold to a post-war generation hungry for innocence. Yet the man tasked with delivering that sonic comfort was entirely trapped inside a system designed to strip him of everything he possessed. Rudy Lewis held a vocal instrument that generated tens of millions of dollars and single-handedly defined the sound of a musical era. But his physical, financial, and psychological reality was a nightmare of extreme poverty and suffocating control. He was never treated as an artist. To the industry, he was merely a highly efficient, entirely disposable component on a ruthless musical assembly line. Stripping away the nostalgic aura of mid-century pop music immediately exposes the cold, industrial architecture driving this profound expropriation. The epicenter of this exploitation was headquartered at 1619 Broadway in the heart of New York City, a structure known globally as the Brill Building. Completely devoid of bohemian creativity or collaborative sanctuary, this 11-story office block functioned strictly as a highly disciplined, vertically integrated, and brutally efficient pop music factory modeled directly after the automotive assembly lines of Detroit. The building functioned as a self-contained ecosystem of corporate musical manufacturing. On the lower floors, publishing executives sat behind heavy mahogany desks, analyzing market trends and calculating exactly what demographic of white teenagers possessed the most disposable income. Above them, crammed into tiny, unventilated, windowless cubicles, a small army of contracted songwriters clocked in every morning at 9 o'clock. They sat at upright pianos separated only by thin plasterboard walls, creating a deafening, overlapping cacophony of competing melodies. They were assigned strict quotas, ordered to churn out sheet music calculated for maximum commercial impact, blending sanitized rhythm and blues with easily digestible pop structures. In this industrial process, the creation of the music was completely severed from the performance of the music. The song was written, the arrangement was finalized, the studio session musicians were booked, and the marketing strategy was locked in before a vocalist was ever considered. The singer was simply the final piece of hardware required to ship the product. For the corporate entity known as the Drifters, that piece of hardware was entirely interchangeable. The architect of this specific brand of human machinery was a man named George Treadwell. Treadwell was a former jazz trumpeter turned talent manager who recognized a fundamental, highly lucrative flaw in the traditional band structure. He observed that when vocal groups achieved massive success, the individual singers inevitably realized their own market value. They would begin to demand higher performance fees, an equitable share of the publishing rights, and creative control over their own careers. This organic accumulation of leverage threatened the profit margins of the management syndicates. Treadwell engineered a legal and structural mechanism to guarantee this would never happen. Far removed from managing a brotherhood of musicians, Treadwell operated the group strictly as a limited liability corporation. He secured the exclusive legal trademark to the name The Drifters. By owning the brand, he effectively owned the entirety of the group's market value. The men who actually stood on the stage, the men whose vocal cords vibrated to create the hit records, were legally classified as at-will employees. They were independent contractors signing documents that explicitly stripped them of any claim to the group's identity or the resulting intellectual property. Treadwell pioneered what became known as the revolving door management policy. He treated the vocalists exactly like light bulbs in a marquee. When one burned out, demanded more voltage, or began to flicker, it was immediately unscrewed and replaced with a fresh component. Throughout the operational history of the trademark, Treadwell cycled through an astonishing 62 different members. Rather than a mere side effect of artistic differences, this rapid turnover served as the absolute core mechanism of corporate control. The constant threat of immediate, seamless replacement guaranteed that no individual singer could ever acquire enough leverage to demand an audit of the ledger books. The brutal efficiency of this system was demonstrated clearly in 1960. The Drifters were riding the massive global success of There Goes My Baby, a track anchored by the deeply soulful lead vocals of Ben E. King. King had elevated the group from standard R&B performers to mainstream pop superstars. Recognizing that his voice was the primary catalyst for the millions of records being pressed and sold, King committed the cardinal sin of the brill-building ecosystem. He attempted to negotiate. He approached Treadwell and demanded a fair royalty rate and a salary increase that reflected his actual contribution to the corporation's bottom line. Treadwell's response was immediate and surgical. He did not counteroffer. He terminated King on the spot. The message broadcast to the rest of the R&B community was unmistakable. Talent, no matter how extraordinary, offered zero protection against the power of the trademark. If the lead singer of the biggest vocal group in the country could be erased in an afternoon simply for asking to be paid, no one was safe. It was into this precisely engineered vacuum that Rudy Lewis stepped. Lewis possessed a golden, soaring tenor voice that was technically flawless and emotionally devastating. When he was brought in to audition as King's replacement, he viewed it as the opportunity of a lifetime, the moment his immense talent would finally be rewarded with national stardom. In reality, he was stepping directly into a legally watertight cage. He was handed a contract drafted by syndicate lawyers designed to permanently separate his labor from its equity. By signing his name, Lewis agreed to deliver his voice to the recording studio and his physical body to the grueling national touring circuit for a flat, severely restricted weekly salary. The financial mathematics of this arrangement were grotesquely lopsided. Lewis would go on to sing lead on tracks that dominated the Billboard charts. tracks that were pressed onto millions of vinyl records, distributed globally, and played relentlessly on commercial radio stations. These songs generated massive, continuous streams of revenue through mechanical royalties, publishing payouts, and lucrative licensing deals. Lewis did not receive a single cent of this accumulated wealth. He held zero rights to the publishing. He owned 0% of the performance copyrights. He had no legal claim to the brand he was actively keeping alive and immensely profitable. The executives sitting in the Brill Building, men who had never set foot on a stage or sweated through a recording session, collected the massive royalty checks. Meanwhile, Rudy Lewis, the voice defining a generation, remained a wage laborer, subsisting on a weekly stipend that barely covered the cost of his stage suits and travel expenses, operating under the perpetual terrifying knowledge that George Treadwell could replace him before the end of the business day. Moving beyond a mere physical shift in environment, the transition from the blinding illumination of center stage to the suffocating darkness of backstage alleyways operated as a brutal nightly demotion from musical royalty to second-class citizen. As the lead tenor of the Drifters, Lewis stood at the absolute pinnacle of the American pop charts. He was dressed in impeccably tailored mohair suits, executing synchronized choreography, while thousands of predominantly white teenagers delivered deafening, hysterical standing ovations. He was the undisputed architect of their romantic fantasies, the voice echoing out of millions of transistor radios and jukeboxes across the country. Yet, the exact second the final chord decayed and the heavy velvet curtains closed, the illusion of his supremacy was instantly, violently shattered. The management syndicates owned his vocal cords and his financial output, but the systemic, legally enforced infrastructure of the Jim Crow era owned his physical body. The industry required him to project an image of effortless, sophisticated joy, while the reality of his daily existence on the touring circuit was defined by constant, legally sanctioned humiliation. The logistical reality of navigating the United States as a black pop star in the early 1960s was an exercise in extreme psychological endurance. Operating far beyond the realm of a mere underground act, the Drifters functioned as premium, high-grossing assets booked into the country's most prestigious theaters and luxury hotel casinos. They generated the massive ticket sales and the subsequent beverage revenue that kept these sprawling entertainment complexes profitable. However, the architectural design of these venues strictly enforced the racial caste system. Lewis and his bandmates were legally barred from utilizing the main lobbies of the very hotels they were filling to capacity. Armed security personnel intercepted them immediately after their performances, corralling them away from the paying patrons and forcing them to navigate through damp concrete subterranean corridors. They were loaded into industrial freight elevators, standing shoulder to shoulder with kitchen refuse and laundry carts simply to reach their designated holding areas. This systemic degradation extended far beyond the walls of the performance venues. When the group traveled through the American South and frequently through heavily segregated northern territories, the millions of records they had sold provided zero armor against the daily indignities of the road. They were a convoy of highly recognizable celebrities who could not legally purchase a meal in a roadside diner. They were forced to eat cold provisions on their tour buses while passing restaurants that openly played their hit singles on the internal sound systems. At the end of a grueling multi-show day, they were turned away from the luxury accommodations they could easily afford, relegated instead to substandard, racially designated boarding houses on the impoverished outskirts of town. Lewis was forced to live within a grotesque paradox. His voice was universally celebrated and welcomed into the living rooms of white America, while his physical presence was aggressively policed, restricted, and despised. He was a king who was legally forbidden from using the restroom in his own castle. Yet the racial hostility of the era was only the outer perimeter of the prison constructed around Rudy Lewis. Beneath the crushing weight of segregation, Lewis carried a secondary, deeply internalized secret that held the power to instantly obliterate his entire existence. Rudy Lewis was a closeted gay man operating within a hyper-masculine, aggressively heterosexual industry during one of the most oppressive periods in modern history. In the early 1960s, homosexuality was not simply a social taboo or a scandalous rumor. It was a severe criminal offense. It was classified as a felony in nearly every state across the nation, and the American Psychiatric Association officially categorized it as a sociopathic personality disturbance. Police departments routinely executed violent raids on known gay establishments, publicly publishing the names of those arrested to ensure total social and professional ruin. For Lewis, this reality transformed his daily life into an exhausting, high-stakes intelligence operation. The entire commercial foundation of the Drifters was built on selling the illusion of idealized heterosexual romance. Every lyric he delivered, every synchronized smile, every gaze directed into the screaming crowds of teenage girls was a calculated act of survival. He was required to perform his assigned identity flawlessly 24 hours a day. Transcending a mere fear of bad press, the constant threat of exposure manifested as a paralyzing existential terror. If the mask slipped, the consequences were absolute. George Treadwell and the executives at the Brill Building would not hesitate to terminate his contract immediately to protect the commercial viability of the trademark. Discovery meant the total erasure of his career, permanent excommunication from the industry, and the very real threat of criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The psychological toll of maintaining this suffocating double life was devastating. Lewis lived in a state of perpetual vibrating paranoia. The touring environment offered absolutely no privacy. He was confined to cramped dressing rooms, narrow tour buses, and shared hotel rooms with other musicians, handlers, and syndicate managers. He was forced to constantly monitor his own speech, his physical mannerisms, and his associations, hyper-aware that the men signing his meager weekly paychecks were the same men who would instantly destroy him if they discovered his true nature. He could not form genuine romantic attachments. He could not seek counsel or community, and he could not express the profound isolation that was slowly eating him alive from the inside out. The management syndicate, operating with the cold calculus of the Brill Building, likely recognized the signs of his internal fracture. The music industry has historically possessed a keen radar for the vulnerabilities of its labor force. However, rather than viewing his secret as a liability to be managed with care, the executives recognized it as the ultimate instrument of leverage. A man who is terrified of his own shadow, a man who lives under the constant threat of total social and professional annihilation, is a man who will never step out of line. He will never hire independent legal counsel to audit the royalty statements. He will never organize a labor strike. He will never demand the publishing rights to the songs he made famous. The intersection of his marginalized racial identity and his criminalized sexual orientation created the perfect, compliant employee. Rudy Lewis was suspended in a state of permanent anxiety, trapped in an invisible cage constructed by the law, enforced by society, and actively exploited by his employers. He was required to sing with the voice of an angel while enduring the psychological torment of the damned, entirely alone in a crowded room. The psychological fracture within Rudy Lewis possessed an origin point that predated his involvement with the Brill Building. Long before he was installed as the central vocal component of the Drifters, he was a highly respected prodigy within the insular, deeply devout world of mid-century black gospel music. Lewis had toured extensively with the Clara Ward Singers, one of the most prestigious and technically demanding gospel groups in the country. Within this circuit, his vocal instrument was not utilized to generate commercial pop revenue. It was strictly trained for spiritual testimony. He learned the complex mechanics of testifying, the art of pulling raw, unvarnished emotion directly from the diaphragm to induce a state of religious ecstasy in the congregation. He was anchored to a community that viewed his talent as divine property. However, the economic reality of the gospel circuit was notoriously lean, forcing Lewis to make a calculated, financially driven transition into the secular rhythm and blues market. This transition was not viewed by his community as a simple career pivot or a necessary economic maneuver. Within the strict religious paradigm of the era, it was explicitly categorized as a profound spiritual defection. By signing his contract to sing secular pop music, Lewis was actively accused by his former peers of abandoning his salvation to sing the devil's music. He was effectively excommunicated from the only spiritual sanctuary he had ever known. Lewis deeply internalized this condemnation. The guilt became a permanent, corrosive element within his psyche. Every night he stepped onto the stage to deliver sanitized lyrics about boardwalk romances and rooftop escapes, utilizing the exact same sacred vocal techniques he had developed in the church. He was actively deploying the tools of his faith to manufacture secular commercial fantasies for the Brill Building syndicates. This created an agonizing, perpetual conflict within his own mind. He was achieving global fame and generating millions of dollars for his handlers, but he genuinely believed his soul was fundamentally damned by the very act of singing. The human nervous system cannot sustain prolonged exposure to overlapping layers of severe psychological terror. The fear of violent exposure as a closeted gay man, the daily grinding humiliations of Jim Crow segregation, the absolute financial expropriation by his management, and a crippling, unresolved spiritual guilt without experiencing structural failure. To survive the suffocating pressure of his existence, Lewis's body sought alternative methods of control and anesthesia. The initial manifestation of this internal collapse was a severe, chronic binge-eating disorder. In the grueling isolation of segregated motel rooms and cramped tour buses, food became the only variable in his life that he could independently manage. The disorder triggered violent fluctuations in his physical weight, stripping him of the one asset the management syndicate demanded he maintain: his marketable, polished physical image. The corporate architecture of the Drifters relied heavily on selling a specific highly manicured aesthetic to the teenage demographic. The vocalists were required to fit perfectly into tailored, slim-cut mohair suits. When Lewis's weight spiked uncontrollably as a direct trauma response to his environment, the management did not offer medical intervention or psychological support. They viewed his fluctuating body mass strictly as a corporate liability that threatened record sales. He was subjected to intense, humiliating scrutiny regarding his appearance. He was forced into crash diets and extreme physical restriction prior to major television appearances and national tours, generating an intense cycle of self-loathing. He despised the physical vessel that the public idolized, feeling completely alienated from the handsome, smiling face printed on the record sleeves. When the caloric intake failed to provide sufficient psychological insulation against the realities of his life, Lewis escalated his coping mechanisms to match the severity of his environment. He found a far more effective absolute chemical escape hatch: heroin. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, heroin was deeply entrenched in the jazz and rhythm and blues touring circuits. Eschewing its reputation as a recreational indulgence or party drug, performers like Lewis deployed the narcotic strictly as a desperate biochemical survival tool. Heroin possessed the precise pharmacological properties required to numb the physical exhaustion of performing multiple high-energy shows a day. More importantly, it successfully quieted the deafening psychological terror of the closet, muted the sting of racial degradation, and temporarily silenced the religious guilt tearing at his conscience. Under the influence of the drug, the concrete walls of the freight elevators and the hostility of the Jim Crow South ceased to matter. The management syndicate, operating with the cold, predatory calculus of the music industry, was fully aware of Lewis's escalating chemical dependency. Yet George Treadwell and the executives made no attempt to intervene, to finance rehabilitation, or to alter the grueling touring schedule that was actively driving his addiction. In the operational logic of the Brill Building, an addicted artist was the perfect, highly optimized employee. A vocalist dependent on a steady supply of illegal narcotics is a fundamentally compromised individual. They live in a state of constant, desperate need. A man focused entirely on securing his next fix lacks the psychological clarity, the financial resources, and the organizational capacity to hire outside legal counsel. He cannot initiate an audit of the royalty ledgers. He will never attempt to unionize his fellow singers or demand the publishing rights to his own hit records. By tacitly ignoring his heroin use, the management structure effectively weaponized Lewis's addiction against him. They maintained absolute control over his minimal flat-rate weekly salary, understanding that this meager paycheck was the only thing standing between Lewis and severe narcotic withdrawal. He was chemically shackled to the franchise. He could not walk away from the grueling tours, and he could not threaten to breach his contract because the syndicate controlled the capital required to fund his anesthesia. They watched him systematically destroy his own biological machinery, accepting the physical deterioration as a necessary operational cost to guarantee his total unquestioning compliance. Rudy Lewis was allowed to slowly kill himself in plain sight, provided he continued to hit his vocal marks inside the recording studio, and consistently delivered the millions of dollars in revenue required to keep the empire expanding. The calendar turned to May 20th, 1964. The Drifters were scheduled for a critical, high-stakes recording session at Atlantic Records the following morning. The track waiting for them was Under the Boardwalk, a song meticulously engineered by the Brill Building syndicates to dominate the upcoming summer radio programming. It was written specifically to exploit the emotional resonance and technical range of Rudy Lewis's voice. Yet, as the executives who owned his contract retreated to their luxury apartments and heavily guarded suburban estates, Lewis found himself entirely alone in a rented room at a hotel in Harlem. This geographic separation was the ultimate physical manifestation of his reality. He was the golden asset generating the wealth, but he was geographically and socially quarantined in a segregated district, isolated from the empire he was actively building. The exact biological sequence of events that occurred within that Harlem hotel room remains permanently obscured by systemic negligence. But the cumulative trauma leading to that night was undeniable. Lewis was operating under a catastrophic state of physiological and psychological debt. He was 27 years old, but his internal organs and nervous system had been subjected to the wear and tear of a man decades older. The relentless, punishing momentum of the Jim Crow touring circuit had deprived him of restorative sleep for years. The chronic, vibrating terror of hiding his sexuality had flooded his system with a continuous toxic stream of cortisol. To artificially sustain his performance output, his body had been heavily saturated with heroin, while his binge-eating disorder had subjected his cardiovascular system to violent, rapid fluctuations in mass and extreme blood pressure spikes. The human body is a highly resilient machine, but it possesses absolute limits. On the night of May 20th, the biological machinery of Rudy Lewis simply seized. The morning of May 21st arrived with the mechanical precision of the recording industry. Studio time was booked, the session musicians were tuning their instruments, and the audio engineers were threading the magnetic tape. When Lewis failed to arrive, the initial reaction from management was not concern for his well-being. It was intense irritation over a breach of schedule. Telephone calls to his Harlem hotel went unanswered. Eventually, the New York Police Department was dispatched to perform a wellness check. They found the door locked from the inside. Upon breaching the entrance, the officers discovered Rudy Lewis lying motionless on the floor. The voice that had defined the romantic aspirations of a generation was permanently silenced. What followed was a chilling demonstration of institutional apathy. Failing to trigger a rigorous multi-tiered forensic investigation, the NYPD processed the discovery of a deceased 27-year-old black man in a Harlem hotel room with alarming speed and a profound lack of curiosity. The space was not treated as a complex crime scene, nor was there any deep investigation into the potential of foul play or systemic medical neglect. The authorities immediately defaulted to the most convenient, stereotypic narrative available to them regarding musicians in that district. They observed the presence of narcotics paraphernalia, or simply relied on Lewis's known history and swiftly categorized the fatality. The most glaring and violently unjust aspect of this administrative processing was the complete absence of a formal, comprehensive medical autopsy. When a high-profile, seemingly healthy young man dies suddenly, standard medical protocol dictates a rigorous internal examination to determine the precise mechanism of death. For Rudy Lewis, this protocol was entirely bypassed. The coroner's office and the local precincts quickly stamped the file with a preliminary ruling of a suspected drug overdose. This rapid closure served the interests of every powerful entity involved. It allowed the police department to close a case without expending resources, and critically, it insulated George Treadwell and the Atlantic Records executives from any legal or public inquiry into the lethal working conditions they had imposed upon their laborers. By avoiding a forensic autopsy, the true cause of Lewis's death was permanently buried. Close associates and fellow musicians later raised persistent, haunting questions that the official record actively ignored. Given his severe binge-eating disorder, there was a high probability that he had suffered fatal asphyxiation during the night. Furthermore, the combination of extreme physical exhaustion, severe obesity episodes, and chronic stress strongly pointed toward a massive, catastrophic cardiac event. A heart attack induced by the sheer, crushing weight of his existence would have indicted the industry that worked him to death. An overdose, however, successfully shifted the entirety of the blame onto the victim. The syndicate could wash their hands of the tragedy, framing it as a personal moral failing rather than the inevitable result of corporate manslaughter. With his death at age 27, Rudy Lewis became one of the earliest, most tragic, and entirely forgotten members of the notorious 27 Club. In later decades, white rock musicians like Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, and Kurt Cobain would die at the exact same age, and the music industry would aggressively romanticize their deaths. Their demises were packaged and sold as acts of brilliant, tortured rebellion, the ultimate sacrifice on the altar of rock and roll. Rudy Lewis was afforded no such mythology. Stripped of the mythological aura of a wealthy rock star rebelling against the establishment, he was ultimately an impoverished, exploited worker, methodically crushed beneath its gears. His death was not an act of artistic defiance. It was a systemic, industrial accident. When the police confirmed the fatality and the coroner's office zipped the body bag, the news was transmitted directly to the executives waiting at the Atlantic Records studio. The response from the men who owned the trademark was absolute sociopathic silence. There was no halt in production. There was no moment of silence observed in the Brill Building. There was no internal discussion regarding the cancellation of the session to allow his fellow bandmates to grieve. George Treadwell recognized that the studio clock was running, and idle studio time meant a hemorrhage of capital. The primary asset was dead, but the trademark was immortal. The order was given to immediately locate a replacement component and ensure that the recording of Under the Boardwalk proceeded exactly as scheduled, even as the original singer's body was being transported to the city morgue. The physical reality of the Atlantic Records studio on the morning of May 21, 1964, was a masterclass in industrial detachment. Producers Jerry Wexler and Burt Burns had already hired an elite, expensive roster of session musicians, including guitarists and string arrangers, who were actively on the clock. When the fatal news regarding Rudy Lewis was confirmed, the producers did not halt the session to allow the remaining drifters to process the devastating loss. Time was capital, and the scheduled release date for the summer single was non-negotiable. The executives executed an immediate lateral reassignment of labor by pulling Johnny Moore from the background vocal lineup and ordering him to the main microphone. Moore was an institutional veteran who understood the brutal machinery of the George Treadwell syndicate intimately. He had served as the group's lead singer in the mid-1950s before a military draft forced his exit, returning years later to accept a demoted background role just to maintain a basic income. Moore recognized the unwritten ultimatum in the room. If he refused the sudden reassignment out of respect for Lewis, the executives would terminate him immediately and bring in an entirely new roster of singers by sunset. To survive the day, Moore had to completely suppress his shock in seeing a lead arrangement meticulously constructed for the man who had just died. The sheet music placed on the stand in front of him was Under the Boardwalk, a track explicitly engineered to sell a sanitized, sun-drenched fantasy of teenage summer romance. The lyrics detailed a safe, private sanctuary where lovers could escape the oppressive, claustrophobic heat of the urban environment. The factual reality of the recording session provided a grotesque counter-narrative. Moore was trapped in a windowless studio, actively weeping between takes. He was forced to manufacture the bright sound of youthful joy while his friend lay dead in a segregated Harlem hotel room. The globally broadcast recording of Under the Boardwalk permanently documents this enforced psychological trauma. While the general public consumed it as a cheerful pop anthem, the audio track contains a distinct, unmistakable melancholic tension. Moore's vocal delivery lacks the soaring, effortless triumph that defined Lewis's previous chart-topping singles. Far removed from stylized artistic choices drafted by a producer, the heavy, almost mournful cadence and slight emotional drag in Moore's phrasing carried an undeniable gravity. Listeners are hearing the unvarnished audio of a man singing through active, suppressed grief. For the executives behind the mixing console, however, Moore's emotional friction wasn't a tragedy. It was simply a commercially acceptable take. They needed a finished product to ship, and Moore had delivered the necessary raw material. The recording session concluded exactly on schedule, securing the massive summer revenue stream. This surgical extraction of a hit record from a grieving friend proved the ultimate thesis of the management structure. The human beings operating the microphones were entirely disposable, but the commercial momentum of the trademark was absolute. The absolute ruthlessness of this corporate apparatus was compounded the very next day. On May 22nd, the group and the session musicians returned to Atlantic Records to record the B-side for the Under the Boardwalk single. In an act of profound, almost unbelievable cynicism, the executives selected a track titled, I Don't Want to Go On Without You. The song was a melancholic ballad about the pain of losing a loved one. The management syndicates aggressively packaged and marketed this B-side to the press and the public as a touching, heartfelt tribute from the Drifters to their fallen brother. It was utilized as a promotional tool to generate sympathetic press coverage and drive record sales. In reality, the recording of the A-side 24 hours earlier had provided the exact opposite empirical truth. The label, the management, and the corporate entity of the Drifters were entirely willing and eager to go on without him, provided the replacement vocalist hit his marks and the studio clock was not wasted. They weaponized his sudden death to sell the B-side of the very record he was supposed to sing. By the summer of 1964, Under the Boardwalk had exploded across the global radio networks. It became the defining anthem of the year, peaking at number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 pop charts and dominating the R&B charts. The single moved millions of units, generating a massive, uninterrupted river of capital. This revenue flowed exactly according to the architecture of the Brill Building contracts. The songwriters collected their publishing royalties. The record executives collected the massive mechanical royalties. George Treadwell collected the managerial percentages and the performance booking fees. The estate of Rudy Lewis, the man who had kept the brand immensely profitable leading up to that moment, the man who had sacrificed his physical and psychological health to the touring circuit, received absolutely nothing. He possessed zero equity in the corporation. His death did not trigger a payout. It simply terminated his flat-rate weekly salary. He was buried at Mount Lawn Cemetery in Pennsylvania, taking his trauma, his secrets, and his stolen wealth into the earth with him. Following his interment, the music industry executed a flawless, decades-long campaign of historical suppression to ensure the continuous, highly profitable licensing of the Drifters' back catalog to film studios, television commercials, and oldies radio stations. The brand had to remain completely pristine. The realities of Rudy Lewis's existence were actively buried. His status as a closeted gay man operating under the constant threat of state violence, his crippling heroin addiction, his severe eating disorder, and the highly suspicious, uninvestigated circumstances of his death in a segregated Harlem hotel room were completely scrubbed from the official narrative. The music journalism establishment of the 1960s and 1970s, heavily reliant on access provided by the record labels, did not probe into the structural exploitation of black R&B artists. Lewis was reduced to a minor tragic footnote, simply another talented singer who supposedly partied too hard and faded away, leaving the lucrative brand untarnished. It was not until 1988 that the music establishment offered any formal recognition of his contributions. The Drifters were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame during its 3rd annual ceremony. Rudy Lewis's name was officially etched into a bronze plaque alongside George Treadwell, Benny King, Johnny Moore, and the other men who had populated the revolving door. The industry presented this induction as the ultimate validation of artistic merit. However, when viewed through the forensic lens of his actual lived experience, the Hall of Fame induction represents the final hollow irony of his exploitation. The institution honored the trademark. They celebrated the songs that had generated billions of dollars for the corporate syndicates. But a bronze plaque offers no restitution for a life that was systematically ground into dust. It does not rewrite the predatory contracts. It does not erase the humiliation of the Jim Crow touring circuit, and it does not compensate for the psychological terror of the closet. It is simply the industry congratulating itself for the products it successfully extracted from marginalized laborers. The specific agonizing truths of Rudy Lewis's life remained locked away for another 8 years after his Hall of Fame induction. The public finally gained access to the reality of his existence not through a major investigative expose or a federal inquiry, but through the margins of commercial packaging. In 1996, Rhino Records released a comprehensive CD box set titled Rockin' and Driftin', The Drifters Box. Buried deep within the extensive liner notes written for hardcore collectors and historians, the details regarding his sexuality, his severe binge-eating disorder, and his reliance on heroin as a chemical blanket were finally published. It took 32 years for the industry to admit what had actually happened to the man whose voice built their empires. Rather than sparking a profound industry reckoning, this revelation was simply treated as historical trivia, released long after the architects of his exploitation had retired comfortably on stolen royalties. The supreme victory of George Treadwell's legal architecture did not conclude with the end of the brill building era. It manifested fully in the decades following the manager's own death. When Treadwell passed away in 1967, absolute control of the Drifter's trademarks transferred seamlessly to his widow Faye. Under her direction, supported by a phalanx of corporate litigators, the vocal group transformed into an operational ghost ship. It became a legally sanctioned zombie entity, roaming the highly lucrative international heritage circuit. By the 1980s, 1990s, and into the new millennium, audiences at European theaters, American casinos, and luxury cruise ships were paying premium ticket prices to see a product marketed exclusively as the Drifters. Yet, the men standing on those stages, executing the familiar choreography, possessed absolutely zero historical connection to the recording sessions at Atlantic Records. The revolving door had spun so violently that the franchise was entirely populated by temporary replacement contractors, many of whom were not even born when Rudy Lewis was bleeding his soul into the microphones at 1619 Broadway. This late-stage exploitation required a highly cynical marketing strategy to maintain its profitability. To sell out these large-capacity venues, the management syndicate relied entirely on the sonic legacy of the dead. Local television and radio advertisements utilized to push ticket sales did not feature the voices of the current touring roster. They blasted the soaring, unmistakable tenor of Rudy Lewis. The pristine studio recordings of Up on the Roof and On Broadway were weaponized to trigger immediate consumer nostalgia. Audiences purchased tickets believing they were going to connect with the authentic sound of their youth, only to be presented with a legally authorized cover band performing karaoke to their memories. Lewis's disembodied voice was thus converted into a perpetual marketing engine for a corporation that had actively overseen his physical destruction. His vocal genius was reduced to commercial bait. The ultimate horrifying triumph of the American music industry was not simply the extraction of his labor and the theft of his royalties while he was breathing. It was the total legally protected expropriation of his sonic identity long after his death. The human being was discarded in an unmarked conceptual grave, entirely erased from the public consciousness, but his digital ghost was forced to continuously clock in. His voice was mandated to eternally generate ticket revenue for the syndicate, operating as the perfect corporate employee, one who never required a weekly paycheck, a designated hotel room, or a moment of rest. Rudy Lewis's voice remains immortalized on vinyl, universally perceived as the soundtrack to a sanitized American nostalgia. But when the needle drops on a track like Up on the Roof, the empirical evidence of an unregulated system plays directly beneath the melody. He was a man possessed of divine talent, trapped within an architecture constructed by systemic racism, societal homophobia, and the predatory contracts of the brill building syndicates. The legacy of this mid-century music machine is not defined by the platinum records it manufactured, but by the legally protected expropriation of the laborers it systematically drained and abandoned in unmarked graves.